During the Second World War in the Pacific, there were some horrific war crimes committed as the conflict waged on in that theatre. After the Second World War had completely ended, there was a series of war crimes trials to bring perpetrators of war crimes in the Japanese army to justice in a similar way as to which the Nuremberg trials were conducted in Germany. There are a number of horrific war crimes, and many prisoners of war who had found themselves unlucky enough to find themselves imprisoned by the Japanese told of their horrific treatment. One such war crime was the Baatan Death March, where 60,000 to 80,000 POWs were forced marched in horrific conditions. After the war, Japanese Commander General Masaharu Homma was placed on trial by the US and for his actions was sentenced to death. So join us today as we look at the vengeful execution of Masaharu Homma, the Butcher of Bataan. And remember to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Masaharu Homma was born on Sado Island in November 1887 and he graduated in the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1907 and later in the 27th class of the Army Staff College. During the First World War he worked as an observer on the Western Front with the British forces in France. He was a man who had an understanding for the Western world and did spend 8 years involved with the British military in some capacity. In 1917 he saw service with the East Lancashire Regiment and then served with the British Expeditionary Force in France and was even awarded the Military Cross. As time went on, he continued to serve as a military consultant to the British military from Japan, and he was rather proficient in English, and he was even part of the Japanese delegation to the Geneva Convention. In 1937, he worked as an aide to Prince Chichibu, a brother of Emperor Hirohito, and he went with him on a diplomatic tour of Germany, and during this tour, he saw the Nuremberg rally and met with Adolf Hitler. The prince at this time aimed to build relations with Hitler and Japan, and following this, Homma then served as a commander of the Taiwan Army of the Imperial Armed Forces. As the Second Sino-Japanese War started, Homma was seen as a valuable member of the Japanese military, and he was a commander of the IJA 27th Division in China from 1938 to 1940. In this role, he directed the blockade of foreign materials and led negotiations with the British. He stated, "Unless peace is achieved immediately, it will be disastrous," before he was reassigned to become a Commander-in-Chief of the Taiwan Army District. At the start of the Pacific War, he was a commander of the 14th Army, which was made up of around 40,000 soldiers. He was tasked with invading the Philippines, and he ordered his soldiers to treat the Filipinos with respect and decency, and to respect their customs. His approach gained the hostility of his superiors, and they sent reports about his poor leadership to Tokyo. His superiors tried to oust him from power, and they even ordered the executions of several high-up members of the Filipino government and legal system, but Homma managed to spot this. He would rather prefer to outmaneuver the American soldiers rather than to go head-to-head with them, and Homma continued to attack in the Philippines. This resulted in the Battle of Baatan in January 1942, which was incredibly intense and savage. There were heavy losses on both sides, and despite the American and Filipino soldiers suffering from a lack of supplies, they managed to fight on for 3 months. The Americans ended up surrendering at Bataan to the Japanese, with 76,000 soldiers surrendering in the Philippines altogether. This then resulted in the Baatan Death March. This was the forced transfer of 60,000 to 80,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war from different areas. The prisoners were marched en masse 66 miles to San Fernando, and then they were taken by rail in cramped and unsanitary conditions in boxcars. They were then marched a further 7 miles to Camp O'Donnell, and the march lasted between 5 to 10 days. During the Death March, many of the prisoners were beaten barbarically by the Japanese, but this was just the start of the ill treatment. The men were fed little food and given little water, and many died on the march. The first atrocity was committed when around 400 Filipino officers were summarily executed in the Pantingan River Massacre after they surrendered. General Homma wished for officers to be transferred peacefully, but this did not happen. Torture was a prominent method used during the Death March, and one form of this was sun treatment. This is where the prisoners were forced to sit in direct sunlight without any head covering, and anyone who was requested water was shot dead. Sometimes to push the men further, They were forced to sit near cool water to add more torment to their ordeal. Those who could not walk were often ran over by trucks accompanying the march, and clean-up crews would round up and shoot those prisoners who were too weak to continue. Some prisoners were also randomly selected and were stabbed with bayonets, being murdered in bloody fashion. A number of prisoners were beheaded by the Japanese soldiers, and disease was also rife in the march. When the prisoners arrived at Camp O'Donnell, the survivors of the march continued to die at a rate of a few hundred a day, and it's claimed that over 20,000 died because of the death march and the conditions. The dead were then buried in mass graves surrounding the compound of Camp O'Donnell. Despite being victorious in the Battle of Bataan, Homma's relationship with Hajime Sugiyama, a senior field marshal, broke down, and Homma was removed from power and command. He was then named the commander of the 14th Army in name only, having no legitimate power, and it was reported in America that he had taken his own life and was replaced by General Yamashita. The fact Homma was not aggressive enough during the conflict and was too lenient to the people of the Philippines led to him being forced into retirement in August 1943. However, the effects of the Bataan Death March would come back to haunt him. Following the surrender of Japan, Masaharu Homma was arrested by the US Army and was then extradited to the Philippines to face charges of 48 counts of violating rules of war with regards to atrocities committed by his soldiers, including during his command when the Bataan Death March was occurring. He was brought to trial on January 3rd, 1946, with the trial lasting over a month, and it was held at the High Commissioner's residence in Manila. He appointed 6 lawyers, none of whom were experienced enough in criminal law to defend him, and during the proceedings many statements and pieces of evidence emerged about war crimes committed by his soldiers. Many of these directly related to the Death March, and the true horrors of the march emerged from those men who survived it. One witness testified about the executions of 2 Allied officers, and how Homma himself wasn't concerned with the suffering of prisoners of war. Homma claimed he was too busy with other plans for other offences, and that he simply forgot about the treatment of the prisoners, and he claimed he thought his officers were dealing with the Death March in a humane way. He said that he did not know of any atrocity until after the war, which was doubted, as his headquarters were less than 200 metres from the march most of the time. He said how, "I'm ashamed of myself, and I should have known these atrocities happened," but his defence continued to argue that he had no idea what was happening. It's believed that Homma may have stated that the prisoners of war should have been treated fairly, and the plan to move the soldiers was approved by Homma himself. The American Military Commission sentenced Masaharu Homma to death. He was condemned to die to be shot to death with musketry, and it was considered a more honourable death than to be sentenced to death by hanging. Ultimately, it was execution by firing squad, and there was some opposition to his execution, as throughout the conflict he had showed the importance of being decent to some aspects of civilian populations. General MacArthur reviewed Homma's death sentence, stating, "If this defendant does not deserve his judicial fate, none in jurisdictional history ever did. There can be no greater, more heinous, or more dangerous crime than the mass destruction, under guise of military authority, of military necessity, of helpless men incapable of further contribution to war effort. A failure of law process to punish such acts of criminal enormity would threaten the very fabric of world society." After his trial, Homma was held in Bilibid prison, 40 miles south of Manila. At 12:30 a.m. on the 2nd of April 1946, he was secretly taken to the Philippine Detention and Rehabilitation Center in Los Banos, Laguna, to be executed. The man in charge of the centre was placed in charge of reading the execution order to Homma, and then to tell him he was about to die in a few hours. At 1 a.m, he was taken from his holding cell, where he was sitting on a small bench, and then he was read the death sentence. He was told he would die around 2 a.m, and he then replied stating, "Captain, I am being shot tonight because we lost the war." When the time of the execution came, he was taken from the holding cell to the firing range, where his firing squad were being prepared. His execution squad was made up of American soldiers who were prepared. Homma was then tied to a post inside of the range, and the firing squad were then ordered to get ready. Within a few seconds, with their weapons primed, they were then ordered to fire, instantly killing Masaharu Homma, the Butcher of Bataan. Masaharu Homma's death sentence and trial was met with some controversy. It was claimed to have been a highly irregular trial that was almost alluded to being a sham, with a predetermined outcome that Homma would die. However, the event of the Baatan Death March, which occurred on his watch, was incredibly sadistic and barbaric. The way the men were treated was horrific and tragic, with many being killed by not just the conditions of the march, but by acts of pure barbarism and cruelty. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.